The phone rang.
Okay, back to Phyllis.
We left off the other day because the phone rang and Mary Ann wanted me to continue my episodic life again.
Actually,
She asked me,
for 1 second, when we finished, you were telling us that you wanted to finish the story. That when you started college, there were a lot of men, and then.
oh yes.
So why don't you finish that thought, and then you can go back.
Right. I left off having started in college when there were a lot of men in the senior high school program. But what happened was Pearl Harbor occurred, and one of my strongest memories is the day after Pearl Harbor, we were all called into chapel, and President Roosevelt spoke to us very seriously about the fact that we were entering the war because Japan had bombed Pearl Harbor. This was December 7th, 1941, and we looked around and we knew that all the men that were in that class would be drafted and that we would be left as a school only with women. And sure enough, in 1944, we graduated on D-Day, which was a very significant day. And there were only 2 fellows that graduated with us, and both of them were 4F. All the other men had been drafted.
And what was your position in your college class when you graduated?
I was one of the 3 commencement speakers at that time.
But why weren't you?
Because I had scored very high.
I thought you were the valedictorian.
Well, there were 3 commencement speakers. I was one of the 3. And when we went back for the 50th reunion, it was very interesting to see how many of the women actually came back this summer. It was very significant to see them, and some had achieved a great deal. There were a few that had their doctorates, that had very important positions. One of the women that I was working with, Edna Moriello, became a professor of philosophy in the new college, which had been expanded, and others had traveled all over the world, and some had just married and had 6 or 7 children. A few taught for 30, 35 years, and it was very interesting to see how many people we actually did recall and remember, because we were each given a picture of ourselves on the day that we were graduating. So that from that picture we could see how much difference had occurred. And some of us looked pretty well, and some of us looked like we had been through the mill. Some had serious illness, and at that particular time I was well, and Daddy and I had a great time. They put us up in the college dormitories, made parties for us. One of the highlights was going to a Pops concert by bus, and they feeded us with champagne and cookies and sandwiches and stuff like that on our way into Boston and on our way back from Boston. We had lovely luncheon the following day. Went to tour Old Salem and Beverly, and the tour was led by one of the professors of history, so we saw a lot of significant things, which sort of refreshed our memories about what we had seen when we were there 50 years ago. That ends the episode of Salem. Mary Ann had asked me about clubs that we had. When I belonged to the Y, there were 5 of us who were friends, and the kids always laughed at these names: Eshy, Lakey, Faggy, Booksy, and me.
But your nickname was?
My name was Faggy.
Oh.
Fagala.
Right.
We had a club named the Live, Love, and Learn Club. Now, Grandpa and I have both mentioned the WPA and all the things that were being done by the federal government to improve conditions in cities like Lawrence, where there were mills that had gone through a depression period. And Vice President of the United States, James Garner, came to visit Lawrence on Columbus Day in 1936. And there was a huge parade which ended at the Common in Lawrence, and he spoke from the bandstand to all the assembled people. Now, you have to remember that Lawrence had a tremendous diversity of community as far as people having come from all over the world. So you had people who worked in the mills, and not only did the various sections of people from the mills march in the parade, such as the weaving room and the spinning room and the carding room and so forth, you had the French athletic club and the Italian athletic club and the Irish athletic club and the Jewish YMHA had a group that marched. And Fagi, Loiki, Bootsy, Eshy, and I marched in that parade, which was one of the highlights of our life.
Do you have a banner?
I don't remember whether we had a banner. We must have had a banner of some sort.
So it's just the five of you walking down
Yes,
the
the
street?
street with us. Being part of the parade and part of the unit that went from the Y to be part of the parade. Now, years later, after I was married and had 3 children, we had gone up to Lake Winnipesaukee for a vacation. Daddy has heard this story before. As we were coming back from Lake Winnipesaukee, because we were headed for Cape Cod, there was a big traffic jam, and we all had to stop and wait. And we waited, and we waited, and we waited. Finally, we got out of the car, walked up ahead to see what was the delay, and we found that crossing the highway was a contingent of children who were part of a 4-H club parade, children with carriages that were decorated and bicycles that were decorated, and a small band, and the Boy Scout contingent and the Girl Scout contingent and the American flag. And I had tears in my eyes, and the children said to me, "Why are you crying?" And I said, "Whenever the American flag goes by, I cry." And only in America would traffic stop in both directions so that children could have a 4-H parade. And to this day, when Carol and I go to a 4th of July parade and we see the children marching and the banners go by and the flag goes by and we put our hands over our heart to salute the flag, she and I both begin to cry because we remember this story.
What did
was
you-
the
what-
name of the club?
Oh,
I gave it.
So we learned in love. Now, what did you guys do in your club? Like, did you have like secret codes? Or...
Well, I don't really remember. We met and we used to do little projects under the direction of our counselor, and I don't really remember. Mainly, we loved to go to movies, and we loved movie stars. So we would play a game where you gave initials of a movie star, and the person had to guess who that movie star was. Things like that. It was.
Now, did you mentioned there was a piano in the front room. Did you play piano or?
I never took piano lessons. I took cello lessons. When I was in junior high school, Miss Fremer was the director of the music program, and she came to each class and she asked if children wanted to join her orchestra. And the only instruments that were left by the time she came to my class was a cello and a double bass. And I wanted to play the double bass, and Grandma said, "This is not practical." So I took lessons on the cello. And Miss Nichols was my cello teacher, who came once a week, and we paid her 50 cents a week to come to give me cello lessons. And we used to keep the cello in the front room, and in the winter time it was freezing cold in the front room. So I didn't always practice when I was supposed to practice, but I dragged the cello to school every week. I think we had only one orchestra lesson a week, and in 7th and 8th grade I played. Now when I got to high school, the director of the music program was Mr. Salt, and he was a fantastic man. So that instead of taking some of the other required courses, I took music appreciation, and then since we had an 8-period day, instead of going to study hall, one of those 8 periods we would have an orchestra rehearsal. So I would bring the cello to school almost every day. The orchestra met 3 times a week, and you went to gym twice a week. So on the days that the orchestra met, I would bring the cello to school. And it was very interesting that when they had this reunion, just this summer, 50 years after we graduated from Salem, one of the people that we met was a young man my age now, his name was Herbie Sullivan, and Herbie Sullivan had played the violin in the orchestra, and he married somebody who was in my class when I was at college, and he and I reminisced about the orchestra that we had. One of the highlights every year was the fact that we played in a New England Conservatory high school competition, And then both the band and the orchestra would go to some central city and we would compete. And it was great when we came back and we had won some sort of an award, either for being the biggest orchestra, the smartest orchestra, the orchestra that played the most music. Basically, everybody was given certain pieces that they all had to perform. And then in addition, they could perform something else which our director felt we were qualified to do. What happened to me when I was a senior was they had a competition, and I was one of the people selected to be in the cello section of a performance at Boston Symphony Hall, and I became the 16th cello in a group of 16. So
it was like an all-state orchestra?
All-state orchestra. Yes, it must have been all-state, not all New England. As a reward for being in that orchestra, then they took a group of us to Cape Cod, and we went to Provincetown, and we stayed there a few days, and the orchestra played in the town hall in Provincetown. I do have a picture of myself in that orchestra, and then I'm just a very little tiny dot way in the back of this orchestra, and there must have been about 125 kids who were there, and I don't remember the name of the man who was the director of the orchestra at that particular time. But it was a very exciting time for us.
And Daddy was talking about what he did in the summers, and after we finished the tape and that we were talking about the fact that you also went on summer.
Well, it was very hot in my house every summer because we lived on the top floor and the sun used to beat down on the roof. We had no air conditioning. Even if all the windows were open, it was impossible to sleep. My Aunt Goldie and my Uncle George, in the summertime, had a store at Hampton Beach. They kept the store in Exeter going, but Goldie would move out to the beach and she would run the store with one or two people. So by the time I was 12, she invited me to come to Hampton Beach. Now my cousin Norman was 2 years older than me, Robbie was 3 years younger than I was, and my cousin Barbara, who died at a very early age, was 4 years younger than Robbie. So it became my responsibility to take care of Robbie and Barbara. Norman would go and he would work in the store and help out from time to time. So we had a wonderful time that summer. Spend most of the time at the beach. It was my responsibility to cook a few meals and make a sandwich or whatever Goldie wanted me to do. And there's a very famous story that Robbie and Norman always laugh about. And that is that the stove in the kitchen at the beach needed a quarter to turn on the gas. And if you didn't have a quarter to turn on the gas, you could start the stove by using paper and wood, and then you could cook on it. Well, I didn't have any quarters, but I did have newspapers, and I was supposed to fry some fish for Goldie, for the kids, for supper. And I started it with the stove with newspaper, and of course that burned out very quickly, and I thought the fish was all cooked, and I tried to serve it to it, but the fish was raw, and that has become a very famous story in the Friedman Schrager history of what happened. So I must have gone to Goldie's 3 or 4 summers. By the time I was about 16, her kids were more grown up, and she no longer needed me to be a responsible babysitter, and she would bring somebody from Exeter to take care of Barbara. And I didn't go to work really until the summer that I had graduated from high school.
And was it always Hampton Beach, or did they then move to Seabrook?
They moved to Seabrook later. Years later, they moved to Seabrook.
And the house in Hampton was a rental, or something?
It was a rental on Manchester Street. Now, a few years ago, Daddy and I went back to Hampton Beach to see if we could find the place where we had lived. But so much has changed in 50 years that whatever was there in terms of little ramshackle cottages would have disappeared, and there were motels there and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
But that was one of the highlights of my growing up years, because Goldie and George were very good to us, really very good to us. And every Sunday, Shirley would drive my mother and father to Goldie's, and she would pack a big lunch, and not only did she come, she would fill the car with her girlfriends, and everybody came to our house. One of the things I didn't tell you about the house that I lived on Hampshire Street was on the corner of Hampshire and Lowell. Now, on Lowell Street, there were 2 things that were quite important. One was the fire engine station, and the siren was on a lamppost right near my house, so that every time there was a fire, the siren would go off and everybody would jump and run and scream. The other building that was important on Lowell Street was Wonder Bread Factory, and early in the morning we could smell that bread as it was baking, and it was the most delicious smell you ever smelled in your life. And on Hampshire Street, there were a lot of Mama and Papa stores. My father's was on the corner, Mr. Davis next to him, who had window shades and curtains and little hardware and so forth, and next to him was the barber shop, and next to him was a fruit store, next to that was a shoe store, and then there was an alley, and so it continued down the street from Lowell Street to Valley Street, and across the street it was the same way, but there were little grocery stores and there were little hardware stores, and all of these people made a living there for many, many years. Now, many years later, when urban renewal started, and they began to take down some of the old ramshackle triple-decker stores, my father and the barber decided they were not going to move out of their store. My grandmother by this time had died, and eventually there were buildings.
Your mother?
My mother,
Okay.
your grandmother,
Right.
my mother had died, and Grandpa was living with Aunt Shirley. And she had set it up in such a way that he had a refrigerator and a little hot plate. So she would send him down to the store with food because he was, even though he was in his 70s, he did not want to retire. Eventually, the day of reckoning came, and he and the barber were going to have to move out. No way about it. So Shirley found a store on a street about 12 blocks away, and there were two empty stores, one for my father and one for the barber. It was Columbus Day, which always seems to be a significant day in our life. My sister Mim and Shirley and I came, and we moved my father into the new store. He was very strict about the fact that he wanted the new store set up exactly the same way that his old store was set up, with a cutting table, with a sewing machine, with a table to have his iron on, a little dressing room for the people who came, and shelves for his aprons and so forth. When he was ready to leave Hampshire Street, a newspaper reporter came and took a picture of him standing in front of his store. The awning said E. Schrager, and he was holding up one of his aprons. And in the window of the store was a sign which had been made many years ago, which said where quality and value come together at reasonable prices. As a picture that appeared in the Lawrence Tribune newspaper, since it had said that he was living with his daughter up on Tower Hill, he got a raft of telephone calls and letters from people who said, Mr. Schrager, do you remember me? I sent you my daughter, and she brought in some cloth, and you made her a skirt, or you made her a jacket. I didn't know that you and Mrs. Schrager were still alive. Of course, they didn't know that my mother had died, but they were so happy to renew acquaintances with him, and that was one of his proudest moments. And I do have that picture of Grandpa standing in front of the store, and that is one of his highlights.
Turn it on?
Why, he just wanted to find this. Oh.
Well,
The better, yes, we want
we've had a long pause. When I graduated from college, it was wartime, and I wanted to join the Waves, and my mother would not let me join the Waves even though I was trying to get a commission. What she felt I should do was that I could go and live with my aunt Lil and my uncle Bob in Washington. Lil was married to Ken, Bob was married to Jean. They would take care of me. Lil helped me get a job working for the Labor Department, doing some statistical work as a clerk one. And after I lived with Lil for quite a few months, she realized that I was unhappy and that I wanted to do something either with my education, with special education, or that was connected with the war effort. This was still 1944. The war had not ended. So we kept reading the newspaper, and we discovered that if you had the proper credits you could qualify to go into a war emergency course in occupational therapy. I applied and I was accepted to go to Columbia University, where they gave a special program 6 days a week from 9 in the morning until 9 at night. Now, the only way I could go with my mother's permission to make her feel comfortable was to go to live with my Aunt Yenta and my Uncle Frank in Washington Heights. And from Washington Heights in New York, I could very easily go down to Columbia, which was 125th Street area. So I lived with Yenta for 6 months. Chili lived there. And I must say, I forgot that my Uncle Frank by that time had died. So I attended both college and surgeons, Columbia PNS, where we took medical courses in anatomy, kinesiology, and medically related diseases and things like that, and the courses that had to do with occupational therapy, such as all of the craft work and the specialized work that we would have to do with people who were injured, took place at Teachers College. And after that 6-month period, we then had to do an internship. By that time, Aunt Shirley and Uncle Harry were living in Atlanta, Georgia. Uncle Harry was working for USO, and he was the director of the 5th Service Command and traveled to USO clubs in that area. But when it came to choosing a place to do my internship, I requested Lawson General Hospital, which was on the outskirts of Atlanta, Georgia. And I got that assignment. There I worked with blind patients and with amputees. After 3 months there, I was transferred to Memphis, Tennessee to work at a hospital that was basically a psychiatric hospital. I was there for 3 months. And at the end of that 6-month period, the internship was over, and my first assignment was at Fort McClellan, Alabama, which had a general hospital.
Now, this program, were those hospitals related to the service?
As at that particular time, occupational therapists were civilians connected with the Army.
Oh, okay.
And that really was an interesting point for you to raise, because we wore white uniforms, white stockings, white shoes, white caps. Nurses wore brown and white striped uniforms when they were on duty.
Yes, sir.
We could wear civilian clothes when we were off duty. They had to wear Army clothes when they were on duty. When we got to Fort McClellan, Alabama, we lived in nurses' barracks. And I came to Fort McClellan with Mary Britton, who was the head of the OT department, transferred from Memphis to Fort McClellan. And when a half a dozen young women walked onto the post in white uniforms and came to the mess hall, we stood out like a sore thumb. And all of a sudden, all the officers were interested in knowing who were these young girls in white uniforms. Anyhow, it was a very interesting time. And
When you were in Memphis, did you live in a barracks type?
When we were in Memphis, the hospital had facilities for the nurses and all the personnel, which Memphis was a permanent hospital. Red brick buildings for the personnel to live in and so forth. Whereas at Fort McClellan, we lived in barrack type houses, and the buildings were connected by catwalks, so that in the hot summer you could actually be sheltered, or when rainy weather you could walk through the catwalk and be sheltered. Our OT shop had 2 parts to it. Some people could come into the OT shop and actually work on the equipment like saws and weaving looms and bicycles and so forth. And some of our work took place on the wards because some of the patients were ill and could not be brought to the main OT building. And that was where I met Daddy. Every weekend I used to go into Atlanta, but one weekend in May there was a railroad strike. And so instead of going away that weekend, I was on the post and went to the Junior Line Club, which was the nurses' club. And there the officers used to come over and play cards and dance and so forth and so on. And I met Daddy, and he wanted to know what I was doing on the post that weekend when I had usually disappeared. I had dated a lot of different people, but I had never dated him.
Oh. Okay.
And from that moment on, the rest is history. We got married.